So we're thinking about the role of prisons in our society and the impact of mass incarceration on the general public welfare, democracy, and institutions in the US today. And I'm hoping to bring a historical perspective and some historical methods into this conversation, kind of zoom out from the on-the-ground view of prison conditions that Andrea Armstrong just provided, to get at the policies behind them and to show how some of the secrecy that she was talking about really worked in the formation of policy. So I'm going to examine the way that federal policymakers reimagined, reshaped, and redesigned America's carceral landscape in the 1970s to provide what I hope will be at least part of the answer to how and why the US became home to the largest prison system on the planet. What we see emerging in the late 20th century is certainly another chapter in the long history of racial oppression in the US. But the federal government's shift towards surveillance and confinement is also a really historically distinct phenomenon that surfaced as a response to the dismantling of Jim Crow and civil rights upheavals. Previous forms of confinement and bondage had rested almost explicitly on the exploitation of labor and black labor. When enslaved Africans won their freedom after 3 centuries, the convict lease system sustained the growth of the southern industrial sector. Then, with private firms on the road to recovery, chain gangs emerged in the early 20th century, developing the infrastructure and political economy of the New South. Incarcerated people's labor and private interests have endured within penal programs of our own time, but the exploitation of labor no longer anchors the systems of confinement in the way it did in the decades immediately after emancipation. So value is no longer being extracted from convict labor, but the contemporary carceral complex can extract value simply by holding people in bondage who have been dispossessed and exploited by American institutions historically. They fail to rehabilitate people who have caused harm. So today I want to tell an origin story that begins in the immediate post-civil rights period, a decade which marked the unique transformation of the American penal regime. Although ascendant numbers of Black Americans were imprisoned at far higher rates following the Civil War, until the 1970s they constituted roughly a third of the nation's prison population. Only after federal policymakers started investing in crime control measures did Black Americans encompass roughly half of the nation's incarcerated citizens. Those of us seeking justice reform tend to think of this shift towards mass incarceration of racially marginalized groups as the product of sentencing laws and racial profiling, while the federal officials and researchers who implemented new measures justified the escalation of punitive programs as a seemingly natural response to high rates of reported crime and violence in segregated urban neighborhoods. History reveals otherwise. Based on my readings of previously confidential files and correspondence among officials in the Nixon administration and the Bureau of Prisons, I have come to understand this transition largely as the outcome of the desires of federal representatives and officials who began to actively envision and plan for the dramatic growth of the penal system shortly after the election of 1968. Against the backdrop of Richard Nixon's crime control measures was an ongoing prison construction project that began in the spring of 1970 when the president ordered Attorney General John Mitchell and the Bureau of Prisons to develop a 10-year long-range master plan that would modernize the nation's prison system. This plan was nothing short of a blueprint for a penal revolution, a threshold of a new era of corrections, as Department of Justice officials called it. Now, when I first encountered this document in the Nixon archives, I was astounded by its content. It's the fears and assumptions of federal policymakers plotted as dotted lines on an XY axis. And the long-range plan remains one of the starkest declarations of policymakers' turn towards managing, rather than ameliorating, racial inequality through confinement more than a century after emancipation. My analysis of the long-range plan suggests that the entire rationale for escalating the scale of penal confinement was based not on the reality of crime, but on prison population projections. So I'm sorry that this is a little bit blurry here, but this chart shows the ebbs and flows of the prison population throughout the 20th century and the correlation between criminal law and incarceration Remember, this is being drafted in 1970. And we see here that that the Bureau of Prisons predicted that the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which was the first major piece of federal crime control legislation, would cause the federal prison population to soar from 21,000 in 1970 to 29,000 in 1980. So this projection prepared the federal government, and the states by extension, as I'll talk about, to house offenders in the prison system at historic rates. So for the first 50 years of its existence, the Department of Justice operated only 3 penal facilities and steadily opened 24 more between 1923 and 1950. And when Richard Nixon took office, he inherited a penal system that had been shedding prisoners. The 1960s produced the single largest reduction in the population of federal and state prisons in the nation's history, with 16,500 fewer incarcerated people in 1969 than in 1950. But despite this trend towards decarceration, following Nixon's call to expand the carceral state, the Bureau of Prisons prepared to double the number of federal facilities by 1980. Indeed, the Nixon administration's $500 million construction project, what amounts to about $1.5 billion in today's dollars, represented an entirely new phase of investment in federal prisons. A record 500,000 Americans were confined in penal institutions by the end of the 1970s, reflecting an increase of more than 25%, or an additional 120,000 incarcerated men and women. So planning charts such as this one from the Long Range Plan indicate policymakers' expectation of a prison explosion through the 1970s. So the dotted line is the estimated adult population. The bold curvy line is the planned capacity for incarcerated individuals. And here we see the Bureau of Prisons actually preparing to add prison beds in excess of the population projection. Now, the initial groundings for these forecasts came from the crime and Kerner commissions during the Johnson administration. These were the task forces that the president had convened to help his administration design a blueprint for American law enforcement and to develop recommendations that would respond to the widespread urban uprisings during the second half of the 1960s. So the Crime Commission used census data and correctional surveys to estimate that by 1975, prison populations would swell to more than 500,000 prisoners from about 200,000 or so. And the Kerner Commission analyzed census data to predict that young black Americans between the ages of 15 and 25, which was the demographic that federal policymakers and law enforcement officials believed to be responsible for the bulk of the nation's crime, that this was the fastest growing group in the United States. In 1973, this projection was eventually discounted by the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals, but the Nixon administration pressed on nevertheless. So let me emphasize, even after these forecasts proved to be false, this same group of black youth, seen as responsible for the bulk of the nation's crime, and these punitive measures became developed around them accordingly. So together, skewed statistics, and crime predictions determined the future arrest and incarceration of millions of Americans far removed from the secret meeting rooms of the White House and the BOP. As Congress started investing in criminal justice databanks and advanced computer technologies for police, while simultaneously expanding and militarizing police forces in targeted urban areas, the decision to remake the entire penal apparatus based largely on anticipated crime was more a response to the social and demographic changes within American society than actual crime on the ground. So I don't have the space to get into all of the research, police modernization programs, and law enforcement strategies that turned black Americans into suspects for future crime in much the same manner as federal policymakers supported the dramatic growth of the prison system based on future populations. But these new technologies of knowledge production built a statistical portrait of criminality that strongly implicated black Americans in particular, and especially black youth. This statistical discourse, to borrow the term that historian Khalil Muhammad uses, reinforced the Nixon administration's remarkable prison construction project and the racial fears behind it. So I have one more prediction for you, and this one was not actually in the long-range plan, but the gubernatorial files of Ronald Reagan, but it eerily predicts the exact moment when the number of non-white prisoners would eclipse the number of white prisoners in the state of California sometime around 1975. So to ensure that states would have adequate resources to embark on their respective prison construction projects, the Nixon administration introduced new amendments to the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 in its own Crime Control Act of 1970. So Part E of this legislation created a new source of block grant and discretionary funding for the purpose of prison construction, renovation, and acquisition. So now states were required to dedicate no less than 20% of all federal crime control grants to corrections programs. And within the Department of Justice, these efforts were funded at about 75% of their cost. So this stipulation allowed national policymakers to exert direct authority over states while still operating from the premise of decentralization or states' rights, what the Nixon officials called new federalism. With this 75% off coupon from Congress, state spending on prisons skyrocketed as a result of Nixon's Crime Control Act. So whereas in 1969, states allocated 13.5% of their law enforcement block grant funding to corrections, by 1970, that figure had more than doubled to 30%, and some states chose to dedicate half of their federal funding to the prison system. In monetary terms, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was the grant-making arm of the Department of Justice established by the Safe Streets Act, spent a relatively modest $2 million for corrections and prison programs in 1969. But following Nixon's call for the long-range plan in 1970, that figure rose to $58 million. By 1971, Part E funding had increased state spending to $178 million on correction improvement programs, half of which was allocated in the form of block grants and half of which was granted to the administration as discretionary funding. By 1972, this number had ballooned to nearly $250 million, representing a 12,400% increase on corrections spending in 3 years, in the 3 years after the long-range plan was formulated. And by the time the contradiction between Nixon's pursuit of law and order and the lawlessness and criminal behavior rampant in his own administration finally ended his political career, total corrections expenditures had more than doubled, from $1.4 billion in 1969 to $3.2 billion in 1974. Even as Nixon's impeachment cut short his second term, the central punitive strategies that his administration developed took on a life of their own. By late 1976, nearly $3 billion had already been spent on 430 new facilities nationwide. And in turn, every single prison bed called for by the long-range plan within the federal system came to be occupied by a Black or Latino prisoner. Actually, the federal prison system took in more Black and Latino Americans than available new beds. Once these prisoners of color joined the federal system, they were typically capped at a year and a half longer than their white counterparts for drug-related crimes and several months longer for most other charges. If the Bureau had worked to eradicate these sentencing disparities, it would have freed up hundreds of cells instead of merely constructing more. Outside federal prisons, the influence of Nixon administration's penal policies and the construction aims it imposed on the states facilitated historic rates of Black incarceration north and south. Here in Philadelphia, the percentage of Black prisoners in the county jail increased from 50% in 1970 to 95% in 1974. So the number of Black suspects nearly doubled in the 4 years after the long-range plan hit the ground. In the southern states, where various forms of confinement had profoundly shaped the conditions of Black lives for 3 centuries, the expansion of the prison system offered a viable means to both retain segregation and reassert control. Black Americans were less than a third of the population in Florida and Alabama, but they slept in the great majority of the state's prison beds by the end of the 1970s. And with the largest percentage of Black Americans in the country, Mississippi had a low crime rate in the face of popular stereotypes about Black criminality, but a relatively high rate of incarceration in this period. So I'm running out of time. I have to skip and how new maximum security prisons kind of change the conditions of confinement. Maybe we can talk about this in discussion. But I want to just give you one last example to sort of end on an irony. Officials had difficulty establishing a sound causal link between incarceration rates and crime, but they knew unemployment rates correlated directly to incarceration. Federal researchers had discovered in 1974 that unemployment rates had a striking similarity to annual prison admission patterns. So national officials used the direct correlation between unemployment rates and incarceration that had been established by the Congressional Research Service not as a means to advance job creation as a viable way to contain crime. Instead, they drew from unemployment figures as the basis to justify the expansion of the carceral state. Mixing unemployment and crime rates, the Bureau went on to predict that the federal population would increase by 1,000 prisoners alone in 1975. Preoccupied with population projections and assumptions about black criminality, federal planners neglected the poverty, educational attainment, and other socioeconomic factors that fueled both crime and incarceration, using those same figures as the basis for further projections and the subsequent expansion of the prison system. As I hope my brief examples have begun to demonstrate, national policymakers used the resources at their disposal to precipitate a new mode of bondage that unleashed devastating consequences for the health of American democracy and for communities of color in particular. On the state level, the construction of new prisons strengthened crime control policies and shaped incarceration trends as these institutions became integrated into the criminal legal system and available for use. As the saying goes, if you build it, they will come. Like the image that Andrea Armstrong showed of all of the new uniforms just waiting for bodies to fill them. And it's not as if policymakers didn't have alternatives presented to them. When the Nixon administration and the Bureau of Prisons set out to reconstitute American prisons, largely in secret, a number of policymakers, criminal justice authorities, and public figures were calling for the termination of prisons amid a growing prisoners' rights movement, instead emphasizing community-based alternatives. And in the face of this, Nixon's drive to increase the nation's penal population seemed all the more regressive. Listen to U.S. District Court Judge James Doyle reflecting in a 1972 ruling in Wisconsin, quote, "I am persuaded that the institution of prison probably must end. In many respects, it is intolerable within the United States, as was the institution of slavery, equally brutalizing to all involved, equally toxic to the social system, equally subversive of the brotherhood of men, even more costly by some standards, and probably less rational," end quote. The National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals, the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, the ACLU, and the Quaker Friends Committee shared Doyle's general outlook, calling for a moratorium on prison construction. These reformers believed that prisons had no place in the modern world and hoped they would be rendered extinct by the end of the 20th century. In the absence of complete abolition, the National Council suggested that non-dangerous, non-violent offenders should be decarcerated as a first step towards this ultimate goal, similar reforms that we hear today. These other paths forward, ceasing prison construction altogether, community-based corrections, or a decarceration process, might have opened up an entirely different set of resources, utilizing the talents of incarcerated people and social service institutions to create a society that would begin to eliminate the socioeconomic conditions that spawned both violence and crime. The path President Nixon and subsequent administrations chose via the long-range plan, grounded in assumptions about race and crime, accelerated the carceral path the national government had set in motion in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Revolution. By the end of the 20th century, this long historical process had positioned Black and Latino Americans to comprise 2/3 of all prisoners in the land of the free. The question then is why the United States government continues to respond to the problems of unemployment, poverty, hunger, subpar housing conditions, failing schools, with more police, more surveillance, more social control, and more prisons. Thank you.
Go ahead, carefully. We wanted to invite brief questions before the break. And then we will continue after the break with Dr. Williams picking up on the health issues. And also, of course, during the break, there's time for informal conversation. So the floor belongs to those of you who would like to use it. And I see lights coming and microphones passing. Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Good
There's one
afternoon
up there. We have one. We'll start down and then move up, if I can be geographic for a minute.
Good afternoon again. I'm James Neal from Washington, D.C., the Institute of Museum and Library Services. This question is for Elizabeth Hinton. Your presentation led me to believe that there is such thing as a prison industrial complex that is supported by governmental entities, corporate entities. Could you speak a little bit more directly about how that really works and where there is collusion, without being too explicit, without being too transparent, but giving us more of an idea of where the government intersects with corporate interests? Thank you.
So I actually, when I use the term carceral state to really think, and for me that emphasizes the intimate relationship between police, courts, prisons, the crime control apparatus, and social welfare services. I think one of the things that really tracks on the rise of mass incarceration in the post-civil rights period is the increased criminalization of social services in a moment when the federal government is divesting from those social services. The idea of a prison industrial complex really emphasizes the relationship between private corporations, the government, and suggests that that there is a kind of profit motive behind incarceration itself, really emphasizing, too, the role of private prisons in this kind of matrix of incarceration. And I think one of the things to really keep in mind is that private prisons are actually a very, very small part of state prison systems. They're about 10%, less than 10%. Where private prisons are really alarming and where we should all kind of be focusing our attention is within the immigration detention system, the immigration prison system, where more than half of immigration prisons are run by private corporations, which we should all be alarmed about. And thinking about the secrecy that Andrea Armstrong was talking about, we really don't know what's going on within these institutions anyway, due to people's citizenship status. And on top of that, when it's a private firm running it, the kinds of labor exploitation, there's no transparency whatsoever. So that's where I think the real kind of explicit for-profit line is. But at the same time, these prisons that are being built in the 70s and beyond, many of them are being built in rural areas and have become kind of a Band-Aid for deindustrialization. So in this moment when U.S. manufacturing is transitioning overseas, the kind of the prison system, the security state has really become like the new major sector in the U.S. And so I guess that's the way that I think about it. That like this structural transformation comes really, this post-civil rights structural transformation is in the growth of the carceral state and the important role that prisons play in the communities where they're operating, but also in terms of how the U.S. government allocates resources. That and this is the question that I ended on. That resources are being allocated towards putting people behind bars instead of educating people. So I'll end there.
We'll take one more question before we give you a break, and I promised it to the
Thank
to
you,
the
Bob
bank.
Targent. Bob Targent, Princeton. It's kind of a follow-up. I was reflecting on what the judge said. It's all very well to suggest mental health treatment, but it's a question of resources. So how do we get the resources back to help treat patients as opposed to putting them in jail?
Two things. Number one is that, to be quite candid with you, the federal system has a lot of resources. It's really a question on judges tapping into those resources. Just a year ago, I found out that the administrative office of the courts, our own general office that basically is over all federal judges, had a huge sum of money that we as judges could tap into and have people evaluated. Most federal judges don't even know about this. And now, state judges, it's a totally different ballgame. They really don't have the resources. But sometimes it just takes a judge having the time to look and search with the urging of a lawyer for these resources. I didn't get to mention in my speech, but to be candid with you, it's also a question of judge time. And I hate to say this, but I cannot imagine how most judges sentence 15 people in one day. And that is common. How can you find out about them as individuals? How can you have them evaluated? How can you have a hearing that allows you to find out, do they have these underlying problems? Is their drug addiction really schizophrenia? Is their drug addiction really bipolar? Because drug treatment's not going to help you till you solve the underlying mental health problem. And yes, most of these people are black. The guy I mentioned is black. And some of them have conditions that grew out of poverty and untreated mental health problems that grew out of poverty. And you can't do that and sentence 15 people in one day. That's another problem.
So I need to say that we aren't quite stopping yet, because both Bernard has another comment in response, Bernard Harcourt, Professor Harcourt, and then Joel Cohn has a question to ask.
So very quickly, one small data point, and I'll be talking about it a little bit later, in terms of resources. We spend over $500,000 for one person at Rikers for 1 year. It's over $556,000, according to the controller of New York City, for 2021. So the resources, I think we have them. The question
I
is...
take my comment back about state courts.
The question is how we decide to use them.
And I just want to underscore the tension, which comes back to Jeremy Bentham and many others, that the issue of in and out, in some bizarre way, prisons are social services, providing 1.5 million people with housing and some medical care and some this. And the problem is inadequate, and the social services are needed on the streets. So the decision has to be seen in context of how you be provisioning, what the relationship is between human beings and their government in a place called a democracy. Joel, you get your...
My name is Joel Cohen from Rockefeller University in Columbia in New York City. I'd like to thank all four of the speakers this morning, including Professor Resnick, for her introduction. And I'd like to pick up on Professor Darnton's question and Judge Thompson's brilliant remarks. How can we, or should we, move towards thinking of the mental health system and the penal system as parts of a larger system that has to do with the well-being of the individuals in both systems? My mother was a psychiatric social worker and an administrator in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is was the largest federal mental hospital in the 1960s. And she was present at the deinstitutionalization movement, which led to the surge in crimes that Nixon was responding to, and we've heard the story from there on. But that story that we heard was preceded by a decision not to invest in mental health for people who need it. How do we go about reversing that so that we have a single system, which also include public education before we get to these problems?
I'll be quite honest with you. When I had Wyatt versus Stickney and that mother's lament was put to me, it was short-sightedness. We thought that the end result should be deinstitutionalization because the conditions were just so horrific. They were horrific. And so the thing was just to get the people out. Of course, the unfortunate consequences were getting them out meant they were turned into the homeless. They were turned into people who committed other crimes. It was just pure short-sightedness. Unfortunately, I'm a judge, and I don't have the answer to your bigger social question.
So I do want to be clear that it's politics, and that's why I keep talking about whether you're in a democratic or a totalitarian or not polity, because these are all deeply political, as you heard from Elizabeth. The judgments in states and in the federal system are discussions that are made by politicians with the industrial complex, with the political economy of it. And so the question of how you marshal social will, and the reason I keep coming back, I also live in upstate New York where people begrudge the incarcerated, the Pell Grants or whatever, education grants. So the question is, to mobilize social commitments requires seeing the commonalities. Now, 113 million Americans as of 2020 had a family member who either was incarcerated or current then or had been incarcerated. So this is a part of human beings' lives around our country. And then the question is, this is a little bit about visibility and experience, but also about where is social will to see. And we saw this last election being rerunning some on bad on crime, and of course the terrible treatment of immigrants. How do we understand the interlocking dependencies on which we are hinging in a very scary time? So we are going to take a break where people can talk about this more. We're going to return with Dr. Williams, who's got a public health answer to some of this in an institutional fashion and a new energies. And then we're going to also hear from Bernard Harcourt, who will talk about abolition, and then from Dwayne Betts, who will give us a multifaceted artistic and political response in terms of Freedom Reads. So we resume. Let me just be clear on the time clock, which I've been invoked as. So 15 minutes is the conventional break, so 15 minutes from now with someone who has a non-antique watch, which I love, but 10 after 4 we return. Thank you.